Welcome back, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce you to this next session, especially as both speakers have spoken for us before. This is all about understanding the emotional toll of well-being roles, which I think we do not talk about enough. Take this opportunity to engage in the chat, ask the speakers questions, please get involved. You will be able to see a chat box on your screen. So without further ado, I'd love to hand over straight away to Stephanie Palacios, who is in conversation with Jessie Gold.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dr. Stephanie Palacios, and I help leaders and organizations with their well-being strategies and with program initiatives. I am founder and head psychological consultant at SPC LLC and a mindfulness instructor with Harvard Center for Mindfulness and Compassion. And joining me in this incredibly important conversation, like Zoe said, is Dr. Jessie Gold. Do you want to introduce yourself, Jessie?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Jessie Gold. Like she said, I'm an associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center and the chief wellness officer for the University of Tennessee system, which is a 5-school system, about 62,000 students and 19,000 faculty and staff. I also recently wrote a book that's in the background. It's called How Do You Feel? It's about kind of the toll that all of our jobs take on us. So hopefully that's also interesting as a side note, too.
Absolutely. Everyone take note of that. Okay, emotional toll of well-being roles. I'm wondering if we start off by just talking a little bit about what those roles can look like, because I think that they can be really diverse depending on the setting that they're in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on where you work and how they call them. Most of the time, I think people don't get preserved time for them. I'm in a lucky position where I have like 60 to 70% of my time spent doing my well-being role. But I think that it could be a therapist on it. It could be somebody doing outreach. It could be somebody whose job is to kind of work from HR side of things and work on mental health or wellness from that perspective. It could be someone like Zoe planning an entire conference on workplace well-being, right? I think that it can look a lot of ways, but we don't necessarily always think of ourselves in the conversation. What do you think?
I totally agree with that. I would just include to that voluntary roles are something we see often too. So someone who has one full-time job and then takes on this role as like a mental health first aider or a peer support person at their firm or company, just wanting to help increase the mental wellness support among their colleagues. But
And
I
we
agree
call
with
that
you.
wellness champions a lot of places too, right? Like they
Oh,
have
okay.
different departments have the wellness
Yeah.
champion, and that person gets no preserved time, but their job is to basically, say what's going on about well-being and argue for it across the campus or a department or a hospital and in the places that I've been.
Yeah, exactly. And be a sounding board or a safe space where a colleague can come and discuss things that are on their mind. To your point, I think we're really seeing the emergence of the chief mental wellness roles, whether it's like chief science officer, chief mental wellness, chief mental well-being. And I mean, obviously, I'm heavily biased. I think it's wonderful. We're even seeing this in a fractional capacity. So it's so cool that you're starting this out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important because otherwise it's not in all the rooms that it needs to be. Like there's so many spaces and places where things affect mental health or wellness more broadly, and people aren't thinking about that because that's not what they were trained to think about. It's not what their priorities are. And so I think being in the room and saying like, "Oh, by the way, did you know this policy could affect wellness in this way? Or have you thought about how you're rolling out something like that because it might be really hard for people to adjust to that?" is a good reason to have someone who has sort of like a broad bird's eye view of everything that's going on and gets invited to all the right meetings, I think. And so it
Oh,
also shows like
totally.
a value, right? Like if you have a person in a position like that, it shows like this is of importance to our organization or our school or our hospital system. And I think that that also shows employees or students that it's something that's important. And I think that's what people look for, honestly, in workplaces these days.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so getting into that, let's talk a little bit about the main challenges of these well-being roles because it's so wonderful that these are emerging in the different workplace settings. And yet there's a lot of inherent challenges that we have to acknowledge as well so that we can start to problem solve around them. So what are some of the most common main challenges that you've seen in these roles?
I think one is that we don't think about how it affects our own mental health. So I burned out pretty badly doing a lot of outreach and education. I'm also a clinician, so that adds to it. But, the outreach and education part can take a toll. And I think we don't always think about that. And we're like, oh, our job is just to present information. And we don't think about how that information is hard for people. And so doing that and being present and hearing all those things can lead you to be burnt out in the workplace, can lead you to have mental health effects of being in the workplace. And I think we're not really taught to focus on ourselves. So we spend so much time going, how do I help other people? My job is to help other people. And our lens is outward, that it takes a lot to make people point inward. I think even like in my current job, there's all the people who are on every campus doing like counseling and outreach. And I've had to be like, what are you doing for you? And like, how do we even know how you're doing? And they're like, oh, we don't assess that. We don't have anything that looks at that. So, being certain that like, yes, it's important that have these roles, but you can't keep people in them if they're not doing well. And you're also not getting good outputs if the people aren't doing well. So finding ways to actually value that as part of the system, I think matters. I think secondarily, I think wellness is not always seen as like a important topic. It's seen as like a softer topic to people. And so it can often, one, not come with preserved time, but also like kind of be a joke put aside thing, something you can just check box. And I think if you're a person who really cares about it and that's what your focus is on, you butt heads a lot with people because
Oh,
they don't
absolutely.
understand like the value or, the value to the broader workforce. And I think you constantly have to make arguments about money and things like that as opposed to people. And I think that's hard when that's maybe not where your focus has been. What else have you seen?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, the part especially that you were describing about the outreach and education combined with the clinical work, that resonates with my own experience so heavily. So I was a clinician for about 10 years and then shifted into the tech world as a psychological consultant building tech products in mental wellness. And now I'm a consultant and I exclusively focus on strategy and outreach and education. It's my passion. So it's what I focused on throughout my doctoral training, but my training years were always, 90% clinical individual group work. And then the outreach and education was like, oh, if you have time for it, you can volunteer for it. And so I did it. But I mean, talk about going toward burnout before you even finish your program. And I saw this time and time again, especially in university settings and hospital settings, where it's the outreach and education is oftentimes seen as a nice to have as opposed to a must have. So seeing that that's where my passion is, that's where I solely focus now. I gave up the clinical work and it truly can be a full role in and of itself. And so really helping companies and institutions and hospitals and organizations and communities to see the value in preventative care because so much of our system is reactionary. And so it's let's wait until someone already meets criteria for things like depression and anxiety and burnout, and then let's treat them instead of saying, we can be really proactive. We can help bring a culture of well-being into the workplace. And that means being really strong on the outreach and education piece. So that I totally have seen. Um, I think hand in hand with that, there's also this issue on the individual level that tends to arise a lot for well-being role givers is boundary setting. I actually just did a session on this a couple weeks ago. And, the idea that we want to help so much that sometimes we see boundary setting and saying no and self-care and taking time for yourself as some kind of sign that you're not doing your job or some kind of sign that you don't care or that,
Yeah.
oh gosh, you're not as committed to this job as you should be. And unfortunately, this individual perspective can really be compacted and compounded if the systemic culture is one that says, yeah, we really pride ourselves in the fact that no one takes time off. We
Yeah.
really pride ourselves in the fact that everyone works overtime for no pay. And so there's just this ongoing dilemma we have of the individual values, the underbelly of those values, then being compounded by the systemic things that are currently in place.
Yeah, I think I used to believe that if I was a really good leader or really good at my job, I wouldn't burn out. And I think
You're
I've
right.
come to like realize that the answer is really like I will and how do I prepare for it as opposed to seeing it as like a failure. I think I used to believe like I could do
Yeah,
my 17 jobs, juggle them all, and if I was really, really good, I somehow will not be affected by it at all. And I think that that
totally.
mindset is dangerous because you can just take on more and more thinking like, if I'm good at this and I can help, I can do more and more. And then you burn out, obviously, and you're not prepared for it. It doesn't come at a prevention stage like you're talking about. We blow past all the early warning signs and we only notice when it, we need time off or we need a vacation or we need like to actually not be in that job anymore. And all those times are like pretty late in a workplace. Like you don't want to be waiting until that long for sure.
Oh no, that's when you see high employee turnover. That's when you see high like value talent leaving critical positions. It rarely has to do because they've stopped loving the work. It's typically having to do with boundary setting and leadership.
Yeah.
And you know, to your point, I see that time and time again when I'm working with leaders and organizations and their teams. It's this worry that in sharing that you're going through something that somehow means that something is wrong with you, that you are holding yourself at a whole nother level of expectation, that you have to be perfect, you
Yeah.
have to be the beacon of mental health, you cannot have any struggle.
Yeah.
And you know, as opposed to seeing it in a way that's actually, this is us being human.
Yeah.
You're reflecting that you're living the totality of the human experience, and that includes struggle. It includes
Yeah.
things like stress. That's why stress management exists, right? Like it includes things like going through difficult experiences. That's why trauma recovery exists.
Yeah.
And so really wanting to see, you know, that being more encouraged, I guess, in
Yeah,
conversations.
I mean, I think what you're talking about is like an actual solution in some capacity, which is that like the
Yeah.
culture is a big part of it, right? Like if our culture is one where you don't talk about stuff, where the only time you talk about stuff, it's because it's a problem and you need time off work or you have a diagnosis, then even saying like, turns out work-life balance is hard is somehow like sacrilegious and you need to like never say it again. And I think little times of vulnerability and becoming more vulnerable, I mean, it's seen as a courageous and empathetic leader. It's viewed better in sort of teams, and self-disclosure breeds self-disclosure. So if you act like a human, the people you work for are more likely to feel comfortable acting like humans. And so I'm big on the culture piece. Like I'm aware too that when I talk about culture, people think I don't mean that systems need to change. Like there are a lot of broken
Right.
systems in the workplace and a lot of focus that needs to go on to that the people that are in these well-being roles can like work on. But I think when you're thinking about the frustrations of employees and the people in the system, like they can't fix all of the broken parts of how work functions. There are lots of things that go into that. And so having something they can fix, which can be some things like individual skills, like boundaries, as long as it's not framed like they're the problem that they're experiencing that, and
Exactly.
culture, so that they like feel like they can support each other. At least you could go, this workplace is hard but all of us think so how are we going to deal with that? And I think it's a really good way forward, especially as a leader, to model that. And like good leadership to me is vulnerability, is you're human, is you talk about how difficult this is, because I'm a psychiatrist who sees healthcare workers and I burnt out and I'm a burnout expert, right? But I
Yeah.
inherently have to say like it was hard for me to notice, therefore it's hard for everyone to notice, and that is something we should be talking about. And that like constant humanity that shows up in our work is what makes us good at our jobs, doesn't make us a failure.
100%. It's being willing to show your full self, right? Even in a professional manner, right? Like still being willing to say, this is what I'm dealing with, and this is how I'm being proactive about it. And I totally agree with you. We're doing just this natural shift into solutions. So, when I think of solutions, what's really big for me when I go into organizations, I love to hear about the program initiatives that they have in mind. Obviously, as someone who is heavily into outreach and education, it's a passion of mine. And yet, I've learned through my experience that if that is all that you're offering, it's not enough. So, it's one thing to be like, hey, mindfulness, like training programs, I give them, right? Stress management, burnout prevention. This is fantastic. We're helping people to gain deep insights paired with actionable strategies that they can implement in their everyday life to help them deal with their in and out stress of their, let's just say, their well-being role in the case of this conversation. However, if the organization itself isn't checking their policies, isn't checking their support systems or the lack thereof, isn't checking the way that they are literally walking the walk, like, you're saying that you're for a well-being culture at work. How are you showing your employees that? How is that obvious, for example, in recruiting, right? Are you having people go through 5 different interviews and then ghosting them? Um, that's a big red flag, right? Like, what's your onboarding process like? What is your training process like? What is your welcome to the team process like? How do you, look at things like work-life balance? How do you treat PTO? I think all these pieces, that's when we're talking about organizational level. And I think without that, you're really missing this opportunity to balance the two and to really say, hey, we want people here to thrive, and we're setting it up so that you can thrive at the systemic level. And then we're bringing in subject matter experts like you and me to help at the individual level and say, hey, this is the way that you can further your personal and your professional development.
Yeah, I felt a lot too that sometimes people try to do solutions because they're a bit sexier than actually stepping back and trying to figure out what's wrong, right? So the
Totally.
same thing is not true in every workplace. Also, you pay for a lot of stuff and you think people know that it exists, and turns out most of the time they don't, right? Like most of the time
Yes.
you'll be like, "Hey, did you know that we have an EAP? Hey, did you know that we have a mindfulness program?" And people are like, "What is that?" Right? So you do all
Yeah.
these emails, they're not seen. So I think one of the things that I've realized in my job and in sort of my bigger job now is like stepping back and going slower sometimes is necessary. Like being able to
Mhm.
say, like, what do we have? What do people know we have? What do
Yeah.
people actually want? And what are they struggling with? And not just going like the cool solution is mindfulness. So we're just going to buy a mindfulness like thing, right?
Totally.
Being sure that we're like actually doing that is also safer in these roles where we're taking care of ourselves, because we're not just throwing solutions and people assume we can fix everything, right? It's all the
Right.
stepping back and being honest about the pace of our job, what we can do in our job, how we're not scapegoats in our job, can also make what we're doing better, because we're being open and honest about what we can do and what we can't and what time we need to do it, you know?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that can tend to happen very quickly, especially when, you read some articles online, you're like, oh, this thing is really hip right now. We want to attract, especially like, a younger generation of talent. Let's do this strategy. I'm a very data centric person. I get the feeling you are as well. And so I love the way that you're kind of framing the solution of data, right? Data is something that you can get for free. Sure, you can pay the big bucks and have the big fancy programs and platforms. They're wonderful. But if, for example, you're a smaller firm, you're a smaller business, you're starting this out, maybe your budget isn't there yet, you can create a Google Doc, right? A Google form, I mean. You can send it out, people can fill it out anonymously, and you just ask them, what mental health challenges are you facing currently in your job? What type of strategies would help you? And then you take that and you listen. And that's another kind of two-piece process that I've brought to leaders before, where if you've already got these surveys going out asking about things like work-life balance, things like, challenges at work, mental health status, et cetera, that's fantastic. But then what are you doing with that data? If that data is just sitting there on some file on someone's desktop, you are actually hurting more than you're helping. The trust levels will be incredibly low in those organizations because employees will be like, why would I bother filling out this survey when they don't do anything about it anyway? Or
Yeah,
like,
I think,
well, I
yeah.
wonder what happened with that survey I filled out 2 weeks ago.
Yeah,
So
reporting
finding,
out even the data is helpful, right? Like even if you don't have a solution, just telling them what the answers were, that like people makes them feel less alone and more seen. I also think we have this like fear of showing the wizard behind the curtain, but then people think we're doing nothing. So being
yeah,
transparent is also really safe in these jobs. So being able to say, "Hey, I saw your data. Here's what we're going to be talking about and thinking about. This is going to take time, but we hear you, we see you, here are places for feedback." Like that kind of open, sort of vulnerable, kind of changing culture of how we talk about that stuff also makes these jobs safer as a solution. Like we're not just like, "Hey, we did this survey, we're not going to talk to you for 2 months and you hate us all," because that can happen, right? Like, because it looks like we're
absolutely.
doing nothing.
Yeah, and to your point, going back to, talking about vulnerability on the job, it's letting people in on the process as you go. So not thinking that you have to have a solution and it has to be done within, a certain amount of time, but letting people in on it. We receive the data, we're looking through it. And like you said, hey, these are the results we got. Even reaching back out and saying, based on these top three like challenges, what type of solutions would you like to see? Great, we're going to go back to the drawing board and we'll get back to you. And so in that way, people are seeing the effort behind it so that when it finally does come time to communicate the solution, they understand why it's being offered. It doesn't just seem like some random thing out of the blue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what it really comes down to is knowing that this affects us, being more vulnerable and helping change the culture in the workplace, being more transparent, valuing data. Those are the things that I think I heard,
Yeah,
like, and I think that all will make our roles easier and our roles safer and our roles more valued in the system as well.
definitely. So I'm keeping my eye on the time. I think we are up today. Thank
That's
you
why I
everyone so much
summarized.
for joining. And yes, amazing summary, Jesse. Thank you. And thank you everyone.